Hello and welcome to Adipod, a podcast by the Australian Taxpayers Alliance. I'm your host, Emilio Garcia. Today, we talk to William Poulos about his upcoming testimony over the proposed climate emergency declaration. Please enjoy the episode and stick around after the episode to learn more about the ATA. So here we are once again at the Australian Taxpayers Alliance office, and I'm joined by a friend of the think tank, of the work tank rather, William Poulos. How are you, mate?
G'day, not bad.
Good to hear. So I hear that you're giving a bit of a testimony of types later on. Do you want to tell us what that's about?
Yes, so we're going over to Willoughby City Council to oppose this fatuous motion of theirs. They want to declare a climate change emergency. Now, I think this is a fatuous gesture because it's only designed to make them look good and virtuous while they're shirking their actual responsibilities.
Well, yes, you'd think, obviously when we think of councils, local councils, we think of roads, libraries, which you're fond of, swimming pools that are open to the public, shit like that. That's very, open to the public, close to home, things like that.
Indeed.
Very little of what they do would have anything to do with climate science, climate change, any of that. You're calling it vacuous. Can you explain to us kind of the extent of why this is such a ridiculous thing for councils to even be involved in?
Well, first of all, Australia produces 1.3% of the global emissions, and, for instance, Willoughby City Council produces 0.3% of that 1.3%. So it doesn't actually matter what Willoughby City Council does. It's not going to have any effect on Australia's emissions, basically. And furthermore, it doesn't actually matter what Australia does either. Even our chief scientist, Dr. Alan Finkel, has conceded this, that our emissions are so small compared to the rest of the world, and especially because emissions in places like China and India are growing so much, we could drop off the face of the earth tomorrow and it's not going to make any difference whatsoever to the global climate.
Right. And he's no skeptic himself.
No, indeed.
A lot of times when people cite that, they think that he's a kind of skeptical climate science kind of guy.
Yes,
but
indeed,
he isn't. He's very much concerned about climate change, maybe more than someone like you or I would be, for example, who take maybe a little bit more of a moderate approach. But essentially, yes, 1.3% of the emissions fall off the face of the earth tomorrow. It wouldn't be measurable in terms of global climate change. Is that what you're saying?
Well, no, that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that the increase in emissions from China and India would more than offset that.
Because they are increasing.
They are, right. They don't just produce more, they are increasing the amount of emissions.
And that's actually in keeping with what they signed up for in the Paris Climate Accords.
Yeah, indeed, that's right. Yes,
which is interesting because all of the countries that could make kind of a very little impact are the ones that have to act most aggressively, where the ones that are contributing the most to climate change are the ones that kind of get some free rein for a little while.
Yes, so far as I understand, it's because they're considered as developing nations rather than developed nations, so they don't have to dismantle their fossil fuels-based economy and all the emissions that come from that, as other countries have to. And this is why Turkey wanted to change its status from developed nation to developing, so it can keep on going with its carbon emissions and keep its economy propped up.
Smart move.
Cool.
Before we get too off track, I want to get back into the council issue of this. So we've had 60 local councils now actually declare the climate emergency here in Australia.
Right.
My local council of Lane Cove, for example, they declared one.
Yep.
Lane Cove is actually quite a nice place. I don't know why they think that there's such a big issue. And now your council.
Willoughby City Council.
Willoughby City Council. Do any of these councils have any authority or wherewithal to actually make any kind of change that would have any effect regarding their emissions?
I don't know what the case is for the other councils, but for instance, in Willoughby City Council, the motion doesn't actually describe or explain in any way what they're going to do. So I can't say if they have the authority to do X if I don't know what X is. This is another reason why I think this is a completely fatuous gesture. they haven't said at all what they want to do, or how much it's going to cost, or how we're going to pay for it.
I just wonder, though, even if they had some kind of plan, does this council have any type of authority to actually action any kind of plan that would lead to a reduction in their own council? In their own council area.
Yes. Yeah, I understand what you're saying. I can't imagine why they would.
Yeah.
As you said at the top of the show, they're mainly concerned with roads, rubbish, parks, swimming pools, and things like that. I don't know how changing any of those things or implementing any plans or processes or systems involved with libraries or roads, for instance, would reduce emissions as to get us out of a so-called climate emergency.
Yeah. Or even if they reduce their emissions to zero, if that would have a greater effect on all of our emissions, if that would even be measurable.
Yes, I know. Yes, we got a little bit nerdy at the top. I think both enthusiastic about it, but you're quite right. If the whole of Willoughby City Council started producing zero emissions, it would have basically no difference.
Okay, so we established that essentially even the idea of such a motion is pretty ridiculous.
Yes.
Now let's talk about the emergency itself. So apparently...
the so-called emergency. I'm not going to concede the existence of one.
Well, that's what I wanted to ask.
Yes, okay.
So what are they basing their assertion that we have such an emergency on, and are they right?
It's mostly based on emotions, so far as I can see.
Feels.
Yes, if you want to put it that way, yes. I mean, they cite some statistics saying that the Earth is warming and that CO2 is contributing to this warming, and that many human actions are contributing to the increase of CO2 being produced. Now, no one really denies that. I mean, a few people do, but that's
not too strongly. Yeah.
No, exactly. That's not something I'm going to deny. But I think this hardly constitutes an emergency.
Well, yeah, it's interesting because we kind of have seen the signs kind of borne out. It turns out something like 97% of climate scientists agree that the climate is changing, but that's a far ways from a consensus as to if it's warming, cooling, and if humans are over 51% responsible. The scientists are a lot more split.
Yes.
On all of those issues, which would also be relevant. But let's say that we take, for example, the IPCC's report at face value,
right?
Which I don't think is smart to do for anything, but let's say that we did. Even them, and they are way more extreme in their predictions than most other authoritative climate models and reports. Even they're not saying that there's really a crisis. Now, they say that there's a crisis on the back of the report, but my point is the report itself does not indicate any short-term crisis.
Quite right, yes. And there seem to be a lot of people, and the motion from Willoughby City Council is doing this as well, linking this so-called rise in CO2 emissions to weather events like cyclones and hurricanes. And as you say, the IPCC, the most extreme of these organizations, denies such a link between rising CO2 emissions and these extreme weather events, as they call them.
That's right. And if global warming or climate change were responsible for cyclones, we should contribute to it, because cyclones have been on the decline for the last 10 years, as has drought.
Right.
Yes. I believe reforestation currently is actually outpacing deforestation in most of the world.
That's interesting.
That's a good thing.
Yes.
I see a lot. I also see extinctions. The rate of extinction is down. So I wonder if, even if you take all these things at face value, what exactly is the emergency? We've heard of people being displaced due to climate change, so-called climate refugees, and I hear this a lot.
Yes.
What climate refugees are there?
That's just what I was going to ask you. I don't know anyone who's had to move house because of extreme rising sea levels or extreme heat or anything like that. In fact, I mean, there are a few facts which are often left out of this debate. For instance, that far fewer people now are dying of climate-related deaths than ever before because of improved transport and infrastructure, which are largely based on fossil fuels.
Right.
But this is something you're not going to hear about.
Well, indeed, and one thing that I think that a lot of people also fail to take into consideration is that when we talk about actually slashing carbon emissions, where it matters is in poor countries. It matters in countries like mine, Mexico. Right. It matters in sub-Saharan Africa. It matters in China. It matters in India. All these things. Now, that sounds great, maybe in principle. What happens if we actually go and slash all of the... We authoritatively do something, and we say China, India, sub-Saharan Africa all of you poor people,
yes,
you need to cut your emissions.
Mm-hmm.
That would have heinous consequences for poverty, for health,
indeed, yes,
mobility,
Mm-hmm.
all that. Do you want to talk to that a little bit?
Yes. Well, I mean, this seems to be the case in Australia as well, where we're certainly not a poor country by any means. But since the Howard years, our energy prices have basically doubled, while prices in the US and Canada, which are based largely on, well, in some states they're based on gas and fossil fuels, they're about half what they are here, actually. And this has had a terrible effect on small businesses, or big businesses, and especially our manufacturing sector, who can't afford to pay their energy bills anymore.
Right.
So this is leaving people out of jobs, right? And of course, if people don't have jobs, they can't pay the bills, and they can't buy food.
Right.
It's a terrible problem, which the government wants to exacerbate rather than solve here.
Right.
As you say, I think the effect in places like China and India would be much worse because they don't have this very strong safety net that we do here in Australia, and places like the UK have as well.
That's right. And it's interesting because it's also a combination of, not only do we want to cut emissions just by dramatic amounts in a very short period of time, but we also oppose seemingly all of the things that could help us transition towards a cleaner economy.
Yes.
Without impacting individuals. Now, I'm thinking of two things. A lot of Aussies disagree with me on one. For me, it's nuclear.
Yep.
Pretty straightforward. All right, cool. And fracking.
Yes.
Now, fracking, a lot of Aussies don't like fracking.
Yes.
Has maybe a lot to do with more with land regulations, but they still don't like it. But you would agree, nuclear and fracking would be a very good way to approach a reduction in emissions.
Oh, it would be the ideal way. Yeah, I agree entirely. I'm not quite sure on what basis people oppose fracking. I know there are a lot of scare stories about the drilling, infecting the wells and poisoning the water and this sort of stuff. But I think it's another rehash of this sort of emergency alarmist rhetoric.
Well, it's interesting because it's kind of a pattern within this whole climate alarmist movement of citing things that do not happen, that have never happened, and just passing them off as truth.
Yes.
So, for example, wells being infected by this fracking water, water catching on fire because of fracking,
Yes.
Climate refugees, more people dying of bronchitis because of climate change, all these things. And then you say, okay, what's the source? I don't see it. I've never read of such things.
Yes.
I think if you had a lot of data on this issue, if you had a lot of really authoritative information on this issue, you'd be pushing it to the forefront, maybe not keeping it in talking points. So what do you think of that?
Well, I think you're quite right. As I say, I think it's mostly an ideology based on emotion rather than any facts whatsoever. And I mean, I can understand that completely. You know, people don't have the time to follow the data or the data, as you say. It's basically a full-time job following this stuff. And so I understand why people don't do it, but then they shouldn't so vociferously campaign for issues they really know nothing about. And it seems as though the less they know about it, the louder they want to shout. And you can see, I found it extraordinary that people were following Miss Thunberg as if she's some sort of prophet. I mean, why would you listen to a 16-year-old on any issue? Right?
Well,
how is she an authoritative source?
Well,
I mean, if we listen to our 16-year-olds all the time, we'd be having ice cream for dinner every night. That's a bad idea.
Okay.
Well, I've tried it. I've had severe regrets.
Yes, no, I can imagine. Well, Greta Thunberg is, as you know, stunning and incredibly brave. Now, she recently was pushed for her nomination for her win with the Nobel Peace Prize, which I find abhorrent. I really, I mean, she managed to put her name on the work of adults who managed to work towards allowing children to skip school on 3 separate occasions in order to bring attention to one of the most hotly debated political issues of our time. So don't you think that warrants a Nobel Peace Prize?
I mean, you say it's hotly debated. I don't think it's actually hotly debated at all. I mean, there are very few hot pockets of debate, but mostly the debate is rather cooling as the world seems to be warming, if you might say. I don't see what's brave at all about Greta Thunberg repeating what almost every media outlet around the Anglosphere is saying. and in Europe as well. I mean, there's nothing really brave about that.
It's certainly a central issue, I think, was more of my point.
A central issue, yes, okay, that might be a better way of putting it.
It's not one of those things that really needs a lot of attention brought to it. It's not like the ALS bucket, ice bucket challenge.
Ice bucket challenge,
yeah,
yes.
No one knew about it. Now it's brought. Climate change, yes, we've known about it since before I was born. So it doesn't seem that much of an issue. And so I want to turn now, because I think we've covered the general stupidity of this part of the climate change movement. Now I want to move on to single use. Now, I'm not sure how much you've investigated about the single-use issue, but it turns out that we're thinking of more regulations to take single-use products out of circulation even more than they currently are. Now, what this means is obviously initially we had the ban on plastic bags, single-use plastic bags in supermarkets because they were too contaminating and people use them too much. So now you have to go and buy your 15-cent big fat bag or your tote. Now they're also thinking of plastic straw bans, things like that.
Yeah.
It doesn't seem like they understand how detrimental this is to the environment. So do you want to talk a little bit about this?
They don't understand how detrimental what is to the environment banning all of these things.
Yes.
Yes, well, I mean, it does seem to be the case that they've got rid of one evil and replaced it with another. None of these governments or councils have actually proved that what they're doing will be better for the environment.
I think they've removed one evil and replaced it with the essence of Satan. And I'll tell you why I think that. We were just talking about this earlier at the ATA offices, that the data shows that, in fact, all of these supposedly green alternatives to the single-use product are far more detrimental to the environment. So, for example, plastic straws. Straws still are needed. People still like straws.
Sure.
So, what is the alternative? Well, they created paper straws and metal straws. Metal straws are not really catching on, but paper straws are.
Yep.
Now, it turns out paper straws, you think, oh, well, good, biodegradable, as opposed to a plastic straw. That sounds good. Well, it turns out you actually need to make that straw. And how do you make a plastic straw? Well, a paper straw? Well, first of all, you need paper. So you need a bunch of trees for that. Then you need to extract the pulp, and you need to use big machines that run on energy, electricity, which generally comes from some kind of carbon-based source. Yep. Then you have the paint that goes on top of it, the tint, all of these things. So it turns out that the footprint, so to speak, that it takes to make one paper straw is something like 7 or 8 times what it takes to make a plastic straw, and it's similar for that. So I mean, don't you find it incredible that it seems like so much of it's feelings based, yes, but also all of their moves are just largely symbolic. They're willing to change industries and economies based purely on symbolic issues.
Yes, I mean they, as we said before, they just want to look as though they're doing something. But it's always the do something, right? And those things are actually, as you say, end up being far worse for the environment than the status quo.
Yes.
This was also the case in the UK, actually, where Jeremy Corbyn was calling to keep the ban on fracking over in the UK. But most of the heating in the UK is based on gas, which they then have to import, and putting the gas on a container, then onto a ship, and then shipping it over is far worse for the environment than getting out of the ground in the UK itself.
You'd think so.
So yeah, it's a completely self-defeating gesture.
It is self-defeating, and it's just amazing. But it's also interesting to see very little pushback on this kind of greater scheme of things. And the people who are ultimately kind of taking a look at the greater scheme of things seem to be the people that aren't actually so hyperbolic on climate change. So it's, okay, we don't necessarily think, let's say you and I, we don't think that climate change is something that we really have to tear our hair out over right now. There's still a lot of question marks, and we should pay attention closely, but not change our economy for it, right? We can still notice that there's such a thing as pollution and emissions, and those can be somewhat measured. And if you want to implement some kind of solution towards something, these are things that you should take into consideration. And we're looking at the solutions that the hyperbolic people on the climate change end are putting forth, and we notice that they're actually worse for the environment. Now, it's interesting because it's kind of like what they would call the skeptics actually bearing out all of the evidence for their solutions. I just find that absolutely insane.
Yes, well, I mean, you find when any orthodoxy finds itself under attack, it responds much louder than it did before. Yeah.
But you should be able to respond if you're trying to remake an economy in a country, many countries, the world, essentially.
Yes.
If you come under attack, not by being called a poo-poo head or something, if you come under attack by saying, hey, listen, we ran these numbers, this is what your solutions are coming up to.
Yes.
You would think that you would have some actual actionable data, information, different sets of
yes.
information. Yeah.
Yes, well, this is what I meant about this topic not really being the basis of any debate, at least in this country. As you might expect, there might be one side producing some numbers and some solutions, and the other side producing some numbers and some solutions, and then those two sides trying to argue why their numbers are more accurate or their methods are better or whatever it might be. This is not the case, of course, as you know. This, I mean, largely at the moment just seems to be name-calling on both sides, but it's the people who aren't wholly invested in the debate, people who have no real stake in it other than wanting to have a nice country and a nice world to live in, producing some of these findings which seem to get lost from either side.
That's right.
As you say.
Yeah, it doesn't help to have a large swath of people saying that there's absolutely no reason to think that the climate is changing.
Yes.
That's not very helpful.
Indeed.
And there are a significant amount, they're loud. The other side obviously thinks that the world is going to end the day after tomorrow.
Yeah.
And yeah, it seems like a lot of the noise gets a lot of the noise is so loud that all the reasonable voices get lost in the back.
Yes.
Now, I remember Dutton. No, not Dutton. He was about to be our prime minister, but lost. I don't know why he's. Well, his name
Dutton.
is.
Dutton was behind the first leadership spill.
No. In the election, Dutton. Mate. I just forgot.
Who?
Bill
Jesus. Shorten.
Sorry, he is a forgettable gentleman. You have to give me that.
Very forgettable.
He's not a very charismatic person. But what I did find interesting is that him and kind of like his toadies were asked several times, how much is this climate change plan of yours going to cost? And this was by their own standard the climate change election.
Yes.
And I remember they would ask them, hey, how much is it going to cost to implement your plan? And his response to that was usually, well, what is the cost to not implement it? That is even more important.
Yes.
And by the way, I think he had a point. Because I think this is what we call a cost-benefit analysis.
Yes.
In which you have to say, oh, you're right. Let's say we don't do it and we deal with consequences.
Yeah.
How much would that cost? And then please tell us how much your plan costs.
Yes, exactly.
And then we can compare them and see what's best, right?
Yes.
So do you just want to give me a couple of thoughts on this? The climate change election, obviously, it was a flop for the people carrying the torch for climate change.
Yes.
What do you think?
Well, I must say it wasn't the first climate change election. As I was telling someone last week or the week before, yes, I think we've had 5 climate change elections now in Australia, or at least leadership spills, and climate change has failed every time. You remember this was partly the issue that brought Malcolm Turnbull down. Yes, I mean, this is part of the problem I have with the Willoughby City Council motion as well. There is not even an attempt to try to tell us how much this is going to cost or how they're going to pay for it. And, well, I mean, with Bill Shorten, for instance, when he says, what's the cost of not doing it? He's assuming that there's going to be an apocalypse, which will take about a minute, and then we won't have to deal with any of the consequences. Right. I assume if the sea levels are rising, they're going to rise gradually. So let's say, okay, if the sea rises a meter, these things will happen and it will cost this much. If it rises 2 meters, these things will happen and it will cost this much. I'm sure there are data like that. And a cost-benefit analysis describing those situations. Unfortunately, Bill Shorten didn't have it, and no one in the Labour Party have it. No one at Willoughby City Council seems to have it either.
I wonder if they don't have it or if they willingly ignore it. I do wonder this sometimes. I don't like to assume bad motives on behalf of other people, but I don't think that they're stupid. I really think that these people aren't stupid.
No.
I think that they know the basic structure of an argument. And I wonder if they've just seen the actual data and said, this isn't very beneficial to my point.
Yes.
Maybe I'm not going to bring this up too heavily.
Yes. Yeah, well, there might be that, and they also might think that numbers are just a bad way to convince people. They don't want to go on TV and say 5%, 10%, XYZ, because people are rightly put off by that.
Yeah.
I mean, you sound like a bit of a nerd when you say it, and it's not also not very inspiring.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. William, this has been very interesting, and we'll definitely try to put a little bit of your speech in this episode if possible. If not, we hope to have you again soon. And to all of our listeners, thanks so much for taking the time.
Thanks for having me. Looking forward to being back.
Thanks for listening to Attapod, a podcast by the Australian Taxpayers Alliance. If you care to know more about the ATA, visit their website, www.taxpayers.org, where you'll be able to see their mission statement, their projects, campaigns, objectives, and so much more. Remember, listening to the podcast is free, but creating it isn't. If you'd like to continue to see the Australian Taxpayers Alliance advocacy, please consider becoming a member or donating. You can do this on their website as well. This has been Attapod. We'll see you next time.